Hi, I'm Maha, and I'm going to give you some of my tips for intentionally equitable facilitation. I think there are several moves and dispositions that a facilitator needs in order to be intentionally equitable. One of them is to just run the session in a participatory and connected way. And this is about inviting participants to contribute, whether in small groups or larger groups, and making sure that we do this in an equitable manner. So, for example, I always ask questions early on and throughout a session, and I have to make sure that those questions are accessible so that there's something that someone could answer within a minute or so. It doesn't need a lot of thinking, it doesn't need a lot of typing. And also, I like to try to make room for different types of participation. So whether it's to speak or type, whether it's polling sometimes for things that people might be uncomfortable sharing with their name attached to it. And then maybe sometimes having like very short answers, like a word cloud versus longer sentences. And sometimes doing things in breakout rooms versus a large room, and being very careful about what makes more sense to do in small groups in private, what makes more sense to do in public, in a recorded session versus an unrecorded session. The kinds of questions we ask will differ. And I mean, like an example of a question that you could ask, it really depends on context, whether people are ready for that kind of question, right? So this one is like, who's the furthest from justice in your context? If we've been talking about social justice for a while and you know that this audience is already familiar with this kind of thing, you know they'll be able to come up with this answer. But sometimes it can be just an even simpler question than that. And sometimes it can be just a warm-up question, like something as simple as what nourishes you lately. And it just makes people feel good at the beginning of a session when you ask things like that. Another thing, and to be participatory and connected, is to also maybe give participants choices as much as possible. So I said earlier about how to participate, like orally or in writing and things like that, but also give them options on what they want to spend more time on, whether to have cameras on or off. This is an example of I just explained something and I asked them if they wanted to apply to artificial intelligence or community building, or if they were equally interested in both. And then I had slides for both of these things and I could go either way. As long as it's something that I know how to do, I can give them those options and then focus on what they want. And sometimes audiences will tell you something unexpected, not what you had in mind. Another thing related to this also is being adaptable or responsive. And I love Adrienne Marie Brown's expression, intentional adaptation. Remember what your goal is and adapt to what needs to be done in the moment to make it happen. So I always have a plan B and a C, and even maybe all the way to a Z. Sometimes you expect audience to have a certain background and they don't. Sometimes the technology doesn't work. Sometimes all kinds of things happen that you don't expect. Sometimes your time is cut short. So I need to pivot pretty quickly, sometimes skip over certain materials, include things that I hadn't originally planned to talk about, but you don't have to have slides for everything. You can just speak extemporaneously. Sometimes someone will bring something up that seems to interest the group, and I'll let them focus on that instead of what I thought was going to happen. I think one of the things that's hardest to deal with, if you have a participant who has a disability that you weren't expecting and you had never done accommodations for before, and sometimes you have to figure out if you need to completely skip a particular activity or change it a little bit or create an alternative or let them work with a partner because otherwise they would be able to do it. And to be able to do that, you need to be constantly listening and noticing things. And online, you have to really ask questions to do that and encourage feedback, get people onto the chat, let them know they can ask questions anytime. Helps a lot if you have a co-facilitator who can keep track of the chat and people can send them privately so that you can focus on what you're doing. And then just getting feedback from the participants in different ways, sometimes getting to know who they are early on, like is your audience mostly educators or librarians or educational developers or students, or like sometimes you don't know who they are. So you can ask questions or you can ask about their geographical dispersion. You get feedback on pace, like is this session going too fast, too slow, somewhere in between, is it appropriate? And I always like to ask at the end of a session about key takeaways, and that gives me a lot of feedback towards the end in terms of just making sure figuring out what it was they found valuable. And sometimes at the very beginning, I want to know how they feel about something that I'm going to talk about so that I can sort of get a feel for the room. So a lot of times when I'm talking about AI, I ask, how are you feeling about the latest advances in AI these days? You know? And I think it's also important to be warm and caring as much as you can, as much as is authentic to you, of course. For me, I learned from Karen Costa and Maytha Met to ask people how they're feeling. And I think that's a really important thing to ask. I ask in a lot of different ways. I really like doing it in a word cloud because then you're not pointing out exactly which person is feeling how, but you're giving them an opportunity to share how they feel and to respond to that. And it's very important when we ask the question to respond to what they say as well, not just to ask it or whatever, you know. I also think it's important to take breaks when it's needed, let them know they can take breaks when they need to. I think I love Rissa Sarantananru asks people to take a deep breath, and she facilitates that. Sometimes I ask people to stretch, especially when we've been online for a long time. Um, I think it does take a little more energy online to pass on the warmth. And I try to imagine looking people in the eye and seeing them in front of me. It's very hard because you can't hear them laughing or see them smiling or, you know, make eye contact. But if you ask a lot of things in the chat and you read out what they say in the chat and respond to it, that's really important. Or in polling tools, whatever way you're collecting their feedback. And just sort of being fully human ourselves. I almost always have a drink beside me if I'm not fasting. A lot of times my child will be around. It's kind of, I think it indicates to people that it's okay for them to be like that too and to take care of yourself. And we're fully human here, even if we're just connected online. The other thing is, and this is a lot harder, is taking time to build trust, depending on the kind of conversation you're trying to do. Don't expect strangers to immediately trust each other. I think it's important to give them a little bit of time to get into ease into the mood of the session. So warming up is one of the important things. And I think this is a tricky one because you want to make sure that you're not asking people to just do an icebreaker that's just random and uncomfortable and unrelated to anything. And I think a lot of the warm up activities we have here on the 1HE Equity Unbound Community Building Resources site will give you a variety of things to do and just make the warm up activity connected to what you're doing, you know? So like when I talk about AI, I ask people to give me a metaphor for AI. That's a warm-up activity that's related to the topic. It helps me know their attitudes about AI and it just gets it going and it's fun and you can react to it and build on it for the rest of the session. It's really helpful, especially if you're going to meet people for a longer time and have tough conversations, to co-create participation guidelines with them. If it's not possible, if there's no time to co-create, then establish them. Just let people know what to expect. Let people know it's going to be an interactive session. If it's going to be interactive, let them know there's going to be breakout rooms. Let them know if there's an option to not go to a breakout room if they don't want to, and things like that. I think one of the other things that's really, really difficult with intentionally equitable hospitality, but that we all need to work on, is making sure that not only we are equitable, but participants are trying to be equitable with each other and make room for others. And so remind them that when they go to breakout rooms or something like that, not to let one person dominate the conversation and make sure everybody has a chance to talk. And sometimes you can structure this with liberating structures if they're very large groups and you don't know their background. In smaller groups, you can do that yourself as a facilitator. And I think it's also important at the end of a session to cool down in some way, help them sort of get their head around what it is they learned, give them resources and links and things like that. And I also really like to ask people what's a key takeaway they're taking or what's an action they're going to take after they've had this session. It gives me feedback on what they found useful, but also helps them collect their thoughts because I think sometimes we get overwhelmed. We learn a lot of things in a session and then we don't we leave and then we're overwhelmed by everything that we learned. So that's important. I think sharing the slides ahead of time or at least during the session and giving it to them at the end so they can keep them is important. I always make mine Creative Commons licensed so they can reuse them. And I make them open for comments so that they can keep having a conversation with me. And occasionally people will do that. I also think like I just realized I'm doing something right here. It's like using my hands, and I think that helps if you're comfortable doing that. It can help make it like a little bit more alive than just sitting rigidly, you know, in the seat. I hope those help.